I'm Skip Reimer, Executive Director of Events and Communications here at the Milken Institute. And just a show of hands, how many of you have never been to the Institute before? Raise your hand. All right, mostly a few newcomers. Well, welcome. We hold these throughout the year. And just so you know, here are some of the upcoming ones we have. On February 6th, Greg Zuckerman of the Wall Street Journal will be here to talk about his new book, The Frackers, the outrageous inside story of the new billionaire wildcatters. That's February 6th. All of these are on our website, by the way. So if you want to just go register, you can just go onto our website, milkeninstitute.org. On February 26th, Zachary Karabell, who is a senior fellow here at the Institute, will join us to explore his latest book called The Leading Indicators, A Short History of the Numbers That Rule our World. I met with him recently, and it's a fascinating book about how sometimes politicians make decisions based on faulty numbers, shall we say. On March 6th, again, Joel Kurtzman, who also is with the Institute, he has a new book out called Unleashing the Second American Century, 4 Forces for Economic Dominance, and that is on March 6th, so all those on our website. And finally, the next one, and I'm giving you all the ones that will take place before our global conference, which is in April, is The Path to Awakening by Shamar Rinpoche, and I'm not sure that that's how you pronounce it. He is one of the Tibetan Buddhism's most exalted leaders, and he will be here on March 12th. So for today, for those of you who have been here before, you probably know we have a way of asking questions, and that is electronically. You can do it 2 ways. One is by texting, and the other is by email. So you can text the top one there, or the top one is for the email, and the bottom is for texting. So you can do that at any time from now until the end of the program. And we'll post the best ones. It just allows us to go through Q&A much faster. We also have a microphone, as you can see. If you left your iPad at home, you can ask it that way. So we're delighted today to have as our speaker Erez Aiden, who is Assistant Professor of Genetics at Baylor College of Medicine, where he directs the Center for Genome Architecture. He also teaches computer science and applied mathematics at Rice University. In 2012, he received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the highest honor given by the U.S. government to young scientists. We're honored to have him here to share some of the insights from his fascinating new book, Uncharted. Please welcome Erez Aiden.
Hey, it's a tremendous honor to be here and to address this distinguished audience. It is. Now that I'm actually addressing this distinguished audience as opposed to just myself, it is a great honor. It is even greater honor when you can hear me. So we're going to be talking about the historical record, and in particular, what we're going to be talking about is what I like to call a big data adventure. I'm going to talk a bit about this sort of concept of big data in this talk, right? People have probably heard of this idea that data sets, they're getting larger, they may take over. This is ultimately a pretty optimistic talk. And, this is a time, I think, when there is, genuine pessimism and concern about big data and what it is enabling. This is an optimistic talk. This is a talk about all the ways in which big data can be a great deal of fun, while at the same time shedding a lot of insight. And so that's why I characterize it not necessarily as a, study or as a tool, but really, the hope is in this talk to convince you that big data can be, among other things, an adventure. So how to read 5 million books, a big data adventure. There are many different ways of exploring the historical record. Something that would be really, really great if I had the time, if any of us had the time, would be to take every single thing that had ever been written in the English language after printing or before printing in this lovely handwriting and this rather archaic font. Well, it would be great if you could just read all of it. Ideally, if you had a very good memory, now you would have a pretty good sense of what happened in history, at least in the history of English speakers. So reading everything that has ever been written, if there was a y-axis for awesome, I think this would be a pretty awesome thing to do. And you know, for a while when you're a little kid, this is sort of what you want to do. Like when I was growing up, I had this encyclopedia on the shelf, all these different volumes, and I imagine that by the time I was a little bit older, I would have read all of those books as part of, you know, just sort of reading everything. But at a certain age, you know, you discover that certain things you thought were possible weren't possible. They might have to do with, you know, large men and chimneys, or they might have to do with the plausibility of reading every single book ever written. At some point you discover the x-axis, which is that if there was an x-axis for practical, reading every book ever written, reading every word ever written is just not very practical. So typically, if someone is interested in the study of history, at a particular topic of the study of history, people use an approach that is far less awesome, but far more practical, which is to select a collection of primary and secondary sources that pertain to the particular epoch in question. Maybe you're interested in Victorian England, maybe you're interested in the Civil War. Read those very, 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 very carefully, draw conclusions. But there's an interesting project afoot. It's been afoot for, at this point, actually a decade, which is potentially making it possible to do something that is, in some sense, maximally awesome, but also practical all of a sudden, namely the Google Books project. So Google has been, since 2004, getting every book they can get their hands on, making a list of all the books, checking it twice. Actually, they check it more than twice. And then they have been proceeding to scan every single book that they can get their hands on in the libraries of the world. And at this point, they have covered about a quarter of all books ever published. By books ever published, in some sense, what one means is all books that have ever been published, which we still have a record of. There are books that surely disappeared when the Library of Alexandria burned down, which we do not have any record of their existence today. Those books Google cannot reach, but those are probably a very, very, very tiny fraction of all books. Anyway, if one had access to all of these scanned books, in principle, it might be possible to do something very awesome, which is to look at the entire historical record from a global perspective. But at the same time, because you could use digital media, because you could use computers to help you with that processing, all of a sudden, analysis of that on that global scale becomes practical. Now, one thing that I want to mention before we get into this, sort of fully dig into this, is as much as it's great that computers can help us analyze the historical record on a global scale, we have to bear in mind that computers for now and for the foreseeable future and for the pretty long foreseeable future are just not nearly as good at reading as humans are. They stink when it comes to reading, and so by and large what we're going to expect a computer to be able to do when it reads a lot of texts pales in comparison to what a human with true legendary mythological photographic memory, eidetic memory, would be able to do if they actually managed to somehow read all the books. Superman, in some sense, if Superman read all of the books, which it seems from the physics of Superman is possible, would be able to do a heck of a lot more than a computer would. Anyway, so we're going to be limited. We're going to be limited to computers and the dumb things they can do. Still, one of the things that I want to highlight in this talk is, despite the fact that computers are pretty dumb when it comes to reading, they can do some pretty impressive things when pointed at the historical record of all of civilization. Now, this project has depended on the kindness of strangers. In particular, I really want to highlight Peter Norvig and Dan Clancy, Director of Research and at the time the Engineering Manager for the Google Books project. At some point, In 2006, JB, my collaborator, and I approached them about the idea of building a lexiscope, essentially a dictionary that allowed you to track how words were being used both in real time in the present as well as over time. That conversation led to the project that I'm describing, that I'm going to describe to you today, largely because Dan and Peter were kind enough to let us play with their data. So let's start from sort of the very beginning. Where do books come from? So for a very, very, very long time, there have been authors or budding authors, and these people have sought to write books. And on occasion, in fact, on 129 million distinct occasions, they've succeeded in getting their book published. That number actually never used to impress me quite as much as it does now that JB and I finally got our book published. And I was like, wow, that was really hard. I can't believe that's been accomplished 129 million times. It sort of puts the major projects of your life in perspective for you. Anyway, so on 129 million occasions, books have been published. When a book is published, it typically goes to a library, or sometimes it's stored in a publishing house. Lots of books are sitting in libraries and publishing houses, and Google has been collecting them. And at the time that we started this project, Google had collected about 15 million books. So they collect the 15 million books, they scan them in, and what they end up doing is they have now a digital copy of the book, a copy of all the text in the book. They use a technique called optical character recognition to change pictures of pages into text, the kind of text that you might have in, for instance, a Microsoft Word document, or at Google, I guess, your Google Doc. And each of those piles of words, each of those texts is associated with metadata. The metadata includes things like who wrote the text or when was it written. And one of the things that we discovered as soon as we started playing around with this data is that there were tons of mistakes. So let me tell you how these mistakes happen. So in the library, there's a card catalog, and the card catalog has a record for every single book. Now, it's very hard to write down so much information about so many books without making a mistake. So suppose that you've made a mistake. For instance, you say that a book that was published in 1838 was, in fact, you write down it was published in 1888. Oops, dumb mistake. Well, does that actually create a problem? Not so much, because someone trying to find that book looks it up in the library's card catalog. These days, the card catalogs are typically on a computer. They'll find the call number. They'll eventually find the book. The book has the correct publication date, so no problem. And they don't even bother reporting the error to the librarian. So everything is fine, and the library works totally fine. But that, on some level, involves having a human, the human who realizes what the correct publication date is. We don't have the advantage, when we're looking at 15 million books, of having a human. So all of a sudden, the fact that there's large quantities of errors in the card catalog is a very, very big problem. So one of the things that we actually had to do when we started playing around with the Google Books catalog was to go through all the texts and throw out anything that we thought had suspicious either data or metadata. The text seemed a little bit fishy. Maybe the OCR didn't work, maybe the scanner didn't work, maybe someone's thumb was on a page. It's actually, for many of these books, people physically flip the page and then a picture is taken. So if their thumb is in the way, that screws up the picture. That's rare, but it does happen, and so sometimes you will see, the hand of God, as it were, in Google Books. Anyway, what that left us with was about 5 million books. Now, just to give you a sense of what 5 million books constitutes, 5 million books is about 500 billion words. It's a text. If you were to write it out in 12-point font, it would stretch from this point to the moon and back 10 times over. It's a text about 1,000 times longer than the entire human genome. It is about 4% of all books, of all words ever published using a printing press. So what you're seeing is, in some sense, a shard of our cultural legacy. Now, faced with such outrageous hyperbole, my colleague JB and I did what I think anyone, as a scientist in grad school, at that time would do with all this data, which is we said, stand back. We're going to try science. Now, one of the things that actually we ran into when we were thinking about how could we do science with this sort of data is we said, well, we want our study to be reproducible. We don't want to just report that we did a bunch of stuff, but you can't do it because we have these books and you don't, which sounds less like science and more like taunting other people. So we said it's very, very important that if we're going to do science with this, what we need to do is we need to be able to release all of the data publicly that we're using to do the science. So first we approached Google and we said, look, we've got 5 million books. Why don't we just release the full text of all 5 million books? Wouldn't that be a great data set? So anyway, one of our colleagues at Google enlightened us a little bit as to some of the relevant concerns when you have more money than the typical graduate student. They said, well, look, 5 million books, that's 5 million authors. That is equal to 5 million plaintiffs in a massive lawsuit that will be the end of this company. So we discovered that while releasing the full text of books, if there was a y-axis for awesome, it would be extremely awesome. Unfortunately, if there was an x-axis for practical, it turns out to be not terribly practical. So we hit on an idea which struck us as significantly less awesome, but significantly more practical. And here is the idea. The idea is something that we call engrams. Now, engram is a fancy technical term from natural language processing, which means a completely simple thing. A 1 gram is like the word the. 2 gram is, for instance, the United. 3 gram, the United States. The United States of America is a 5 gram. So a gram is just a string of letters with a certain number of spaces inside it. It's basically a number of words of length n, typically. Anyway, it's useful to have technical terms sometimes, but I think that's hopefully the last technical term that will happen in this talk. Anyway, we thought to ourselves, look, let's suppose we just take every single engram that appears in English books, and at least with any non-negligible frequency, and we just make a chart. We make a big, big table, and that table is just going to record how often that engram appeared year by year, going back for the last 500 years. And we reasoned to ourselves using, a little bit of math and a little bit of just cogitating in unknown ways that if you had an engram table like this, there would be no way to reconstruct the underlying texts, and we made this case. So we said, look, this shouldn't violate copyright. This should be a pretty reasonable thing to do. And at the time, there was really no legal precedent for this, but it turns out actually that since we've done this work, actually there have been a number of cases that have actually essentially upheld this way of thinking, actually citing some of our work in the process. So we said, what we're going to do is we're going to throw out all those full texts, and all we're going to do is record this table of every word and phrase that appears with non-negligible frequency in the English language. We're going to write down how often it appears every year going back about 5 centuries. So what is this table, right? Why am I excited to tell you about a table? Well, what's interesting about the engrams, and we actually often use engrams to refer not just the term itself, but to the chart or to the data from the table corresponding to a particular engram. What's interesting about these engrams, these entries from this table, is that they allow us to examine cultural trends. Let me give you an example. Suppose that this talk goes well. It may be hard to imagine. But suppose that this talk goes very well, and tomorrow I call my mom and I say, Mom, the talk went so well. Yesterday I really throve. But then I catch myself. Maybe I should be saying, Mom, yesterday I really thrived. What to do? Well, the state of the art before the engrams table was more or less that you knew you could do the following thing. If you approach the following linguist with fabulous hair, Steven Pinker, and you said, Steve, should I say thrived or should I say throve? He would tell you, well, these days most people say thrived, but some people say throve. We don't exactly know what the numbers are, but that's the situation right now. You also knew that if you went back 200 years, and you asked the following distinguished statesman with equally fabulous hair, you said, Tom, what should I do? He would say, well, in my day, most people throve, but some people thrived. Again, you don't quite know what the numbers are. So now what I'm just going to show you is data from this table showing you the frequency of the word throve and the frequency of the word thrive for every year from 1800 to 2000. So all we're doing is we're saying, let's say, thrived appears a certain number of times in 1831. Thrived appears a certain number of times in 1831. We have, a zillion words in 1831, so we divide the number of times that thrive appears by a zillion, and we get the value that I'm going to show you in this plot. So it's literally, we're just plotting 2 rows of the table. So this is it, single year resolution going back about 2 centuries. Now, linguists have talked about this for decades, right? This notion that a verb like throve, which is technically called an irregular verb, can become a regular verb like thrive. They've talked about it, but using this table, we can see it. We can see it in a very, very explicit and direct way. So I think this is a pretty awesome table, right? When we made this table, no one had ever seen anything like this before. And what I want to point out is that these are 2 of the 2 billion engrams that we track in our table. So the total table is a billion times more awesome than this slide. What we have is effectively I don't want to call it a telescope, but it's some kind of scope that lets us look at historical trends, and we can point it at whatever we want. Here's an interesting example. Right? This is a very abstract concept, right? How do people remember things? How do people forget things? How do we forget the past? Well, to look at that, I'd like to tell you the story of the year 1950. Now, for the vast majority of time, no one really cared about 1950. Through the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, no one really gave a damn about 1950. This trend continued, right, through the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s. People pretty much ignored even the prospect of 1950. And then suddenly, in the mid-1940s, there started to be a buzz. People realized that 1950 was probably going to happen, and it could be big. But nothing got people interested in the year 1950 like 1950 itself. During 1950, people were walking around obsessed. They were constantly thinking of all the things they wanted to do in 1950, all the goals they hoped to achieve in 1950, all the dreams they hoped might materialize in 1950. In fact, 1950, shown here in red, was so fascinating that even after 1950, it took some time for people to debrief, right? They just kept walking around talking about all the interesting things that happened in 1950. And then suddenly, about 1954, 1955, the bubble burst. People realized that 1950 had become a little bit passé. You know what's interesting? 1960. Now this story, right, of love and loss, boy or civilization meets X, boy falls in love with X, boy, gradually breaks up with X and slowly forgets about X, is true not just for 1950, but for any X, right? It's true for every single year that we have on record going back several centuries. So this is in some sense telling us something about the shape of the way that civilization forgets about stuff. Now, I would be the first to admit that I don't exactly know how to interpret a chart like this. In some sense, how would we know how to interpret a chart like this? We've never seen a chart like this before. But it seems to me that this chart is telling us something about how we forget the past. And one of the things that's very striking as you look at chart after chart is that although the overall shape of these charts is the same over time, there's a very striking difference, which is that that decay period the rate at which you forget about the year X seems to be getting sharper and sharper and sharper, as though in some sense people are forgetting about the past more and more rapidly as time elapses. How does that work? I don't know, and I wish I did know. I wish I had a gorgeous theoretical model that I could show you that I actually believed. I think there are probably many gorgeous theoretical models I could show you, but probably none of them have the property of me believing them. I wish we understood this, but what's fascinating about the Engrams is the way in which they expose questions, they give insights into questions that we couldn't before answer or think about in a rigorous way. Here's an example of such a question. So I think people have probably heard of this concept that we're like hurtling towards some sort of technological singularity where we all live in peace as part of the silicon hive mind or something of that sort. And it may well happen. That's above my pay grade. But where that kind of idea comes from is this notion that there is this accelerating pace of technological advancement. Now, how can you tell if there's an accelerating pace of technological advancement? That's kind of a hard thing to measure. Well, here's a simple thing that you can look at using, and people have talked about this for many decades, but they've not really had much to measure. But here's a simple thing that you can do using Engrams. So you can take an invention. Let's take the telephone. You can look at when it was invented. So the telephone was invented in 1848. Let's set aside the fact that no one really agrees on who invented the telephone and how did they invent the telephone. And there are, every once in a while, the House of Representatives of some country passes some resolution about who they think invented the telephone. But long and the short of it, people invented the telephone roughly in 1848. But if you look for people talking about telephones, you don't really see them talking about telephones for several decades. The radio is very different. The radio was invented in 1895, and you immediately see people talking about it. So now we can use this idea, and we can play. So here's something very, very simple that we did. We took a list of inventions from Wikipedia. We looked at the date on which they were invented, and we looked at when people started talking about them, and then we averaged things. So in red, you can see the average for inventions listed on this random list we pulled from Wikipedia that were invented between 1800 and 1840. In green, you can see a list of inventions that were invented between 1840 and 1880. In blue, you can see a list of inventions that were invented between 1880 and 1920, the turn of the 20th century. And what's very striking, right, when you look at these average trajectories of how long it takes the invention to reach its peak prominence, you can see that the more recent inventions are rising to peak prominence faster and faster and faster. So for instance, you can ask, how long does it take for you to get to 25% of your peak prominence? For inventions from the early 19th century, it takes about 65 years to hit that mark. For inventions from the turn of the 20th century, it takes only 26 years to hit that mark. Now, is this a complete analysis, perfect analysis? No, it is not. We've done some other things of this type, and they all generally converge around this picture of things. But I don't want to say that this is the end-all and be-all of this sort of analysis. But the point is that we can ask this question, and we can deploy data in a meaningful way to probe what the answer might be. And that's one of the things that I find very, very exciting about the Ngram data. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting to look at in the Ngram data is people. People are interesting. You probably know some interesting people yourself. People are interesting for many different reasons. Charles Darwin is interesting for different reasons than Che Guevara. Many different things can make people very, very widely talked about. One of the things that we can actually do with the Ngram data is we can ask for all the people, we can in some sense do, as everyone has like this hall of fame, right? There's like football has a hall of fame, baseball has a hall of fame, I think scientists, they have a science hall of fame. Everyone has a hall of fame, but we can actually be totally objective about it. We can say, look, we're just going to do quote unquote the hall of fame, based on how frequently people are talked about in books or written texts more generally in the future. And so we can ask, for instance, of all the people born in 1871, the class of 1871, as it were, who are the 25 or 50 most famous people born in that year? And here's actually a list of some of them. Here are actually the charts of all of them and a list of some of them. And you can see the very, very different ways in which people become famous. Orville Wright became famous because he figured out how to fly. Ernest Rutherford became famous because of his scattering experiments. Marcel Proust wrote some pretty good books. Does anyone actually here know why Cordell Hull got famous? Can you raise your hand if you know who Cordell Hull is? Yes, there's a Secretary of State. That's great. This audience is actually fantastic. You guys, percentage-wise, clobbered pretty much the vast majority of groups that I've ever talked to about this. And so Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State under FDR's longest serving Secretary of State in US history, served for 11 years. During World War II, among other things, was one of the principal architects of the United Nations. And in fact was referred to as the father of the United Nations by FDR, who he served under. Cordell Hull is actually the valedictorian of the class of 1871, and it's kind of sad in some sense that frequently when I give this talk and show people this slide, Cordell Hull is one of the people that folks tend to not recognize. But Cordell Hull actually has a larger footprint in the historical record than anyone else born in 1871. Now, one of the interesting things is that if you take any class, right? You take the class of 1871 and you sort of take the average of all the people in the class of 1871. There's always a typical shape that you get, and you could do the same thing for 1872. 50 completely different people, same shape, and that shape is shown here in gray. And what you basically see is that extremely famous people, more or less, on the average, seem to observe the same sort of trajectory, which is that they're born and nobody really knows who they are. There are some exceptions, actually. I mean, if you are going to be the King of England, you are typically famous even before you are born. But for instance, Orville Wright, when he was 12 years old, riding around on a bike, telling people that he was one day going to fly, no one cared. But eventually, you get to the point where folks make their debut. And particularly the class of 1871 makes their debut in 1908. And by debut, I mean that more than half of the class is famous. What do I mean by famous? The definition that we use for fame, which I think is a little bit arbitrary, but it seems like a reasonable start, is we say, what are the least frequent words in dictionaries? The least frequent words in dictionaries appear about 1 part per billion in the English language. So if your name appears about 1 part per billion in the English language, then if the dictionary was not biased against proper nouns, then you should be in the dictionary. Now, I mean, as it is, right, dictionaries, I think, globally suffer from extreme proper nounism, and this bias against proper nouns has kept many people from being in the dictionary. But if you belong in the dictionary, then we say you're famous. So people by 1908, about half of the members of the class of 1871 were being talked about as often as the least frequent words in the dictionary. Now what happens next is, and what I want to point out is that every tick mark on the y-axis here is a factor of 10. What happens actually starting in 1908, the class of 1871, is that they double in fame every about 5 or so years until they hit a peak in 1946. That is when the class of 1871 is most famous. It's actually about 75 years after their birth. Now, after 1946, they start to become less famous, and typically about every century. Right? The rate you start to see a decline. The rate of the decline is roughly that they become roughly half as famous every century that passes. Now, what's interesting when you look at this is that we can kind of quantify those numbers. We can see how those numbers are changing. One of the things that's very striking is that contemporary celebrities become famous much younger. You can see the debut for the class of 1871 was at the age of, excuse me, I don't know what age I said before, but at the age of 37. Typically, though, today, for instance, folks born in the 1930s, 1940s, typically rise to fame by their late 20s, by about age 29. So if you're not, very, very famous and you're over 29, this is very concerning. I actually, JB and I discovered this when he was 28 and I was 30. So he had a much rosier outlook about it than I did. Anyway, so folks are getting famous younger and younger. They're actually getting more and more famous. That acceleration that you see between their debut and their peak is getting faster and faster and faster. The peak has been consistently roughly 75, going back as far as we can see, but that decline is actually also getting faster and faster. So people today, the most extremely famous people, are more famous than they have ever been, but they're also forgotten more rapidly than they have ever been.
Miley Cyrus.
For instance. Anyway, I want to give people some guidance. I mean, this may be relevant to some people in this room. This may be relevant to friends, family members, loved ones, based on some of our data to help you choose a career. One of the things that I actually found very frustrating when I was trying to choose a career was that people give you these like very, very loosey-goosey suggestions. They say, oh, follow your bliss. And if I knew how to follow my bliss, right, life would be much easier, but that's why you're kind of getting advice from somebody. And it's very, very vague, It's not going to pass in the world of big data, right? We just want to analyze the data, see what the right answer is. So anyway, here's something that we did. We looked at everyone in the 19th century. We classified. We took people in a bunch of different careers. We took political figures, authors, actors. We took some different kinds of scientists and mathematicians. We saw how well they did as a function of time, just to see, what would a good career choice have been in the 19th century. Admittedly, the 20th century is a little bit different. 21st century is still more different, but it gives you a picture. So if you want to get famous young, what you should do is be an actor. Actors get famous in their mid-20s and have decades to enjoy being very famous. But it turns out, at least in the 19th century, before the age of television, if you wanted to become really famous, you were better off becoming an author, right? Because there was already mass media for books. Authors typically got famous later in their mid to late 30s, but they got much more famous than the actors. But if you really were capable of delaying gratification, then you should become a politician. Politicians typically don't get extremely famous in their late 50s or 60s, but the most extremely famous politicians are typically the leaders, president of the United States or leader of some other very large nation, and they rapidly soar to be the most famous of all the groups. So you can also be a scientist or an artist. Scientists in the 19th century typically became as famous as the actors, but only in their 70s, right? So the actors have been enjoying the fame for like 50 years. A scientist gets famous and is in their 70s, doesn't have quite as long to enjoy it. Artists don't seem to get as famous as scientists, but the thing that you really don't want to do, and I say this as someone with a PhD in applied mathematics. You think when you're going into mathematics, you hear the following story. Right? I heard this story. This story influenced me a lot. Mathematicians do their best work when they're young. That's great. You work hard in your late teens, in your early 20s. You do phenomenal work. And then you can just kick back and do nothing, right? You've got tenure, and no one really expects you to do anything anyway. So clearly, right, if you want to get famous young, you should be a mathematician. But the problem is that mathematicians, whenever they do their best work, no one seems to notice. Mathematicians in this data set, the 25 most famous mathematicians born in the 19th century only start to have an appreciable signal in their 70s and 80s, by which time most of them are not present to appreciate it. So that's a rookie mistake. We've been talking about stuff that I think is a lot of fun. And the Engrams data is, I would say, by and large, a very fun data set. But there are very, very sobering, distressing, and concerning Engrams. And I think some of the most sobering engrams are some of the ones that I'd like to show you now. So this is the trajectory for Marc Chagall, an abstract expressionist artist in the English language. And this is a typical trajectory for a famous person. At some point they have a debut, they become more and more and more famous. This is normal. Here's Marc Chagall in German, now in green. And what you're seeing, and I know you haven't seen quite as many of these as I have, what you're seeing is incredibly abnormal, right? Chagall becomes quite well known and then disappears. And for an 8-year period, Chagall's full name only appears once in the entire German corpus. So you're really seeing the disappearance of Marc Chagall from public discourse in Germany. So what was happening? Well, Marc Chagall, between 1933 and 1945, was an abstract expressionist, and between 1933 and 1945 was the Nazi regime in Germany. The Nazi regime was very opposed, actually. I mean, they had very strong opinions on things like abstract expressionism. In particular, Marc Chagall was Jewish. They had very strong opinions about that, too. And you see lots of people who obey this sort of pattern where they're just disappearing from public life. And one of the very striking things about the Engrams data is we have some sense, that the Nazis suppressed information. We can document that in many different sorts of ways. But we have some sense that that is happening around the world, that different governments in the world are suppressing different forms of information. But it is very, very hard to measure how that is happening. And what's actually possible with Engrams data is you can look at a censorship campaign in some sense in kind of an objective way and say, how effective was this censorship campaign? In a totalitarian regime like the Nazi regime, how effectively can they obliterate an idea? Now, in the specific case of the Nazi regime, it's a little bit simpler to look at some of this stuff because, tragically, they were incredibly well organized about their censorship campaign. There's this librarian named Wolfgang Herrmann, and he actually prepared incredibly detailed blacklists that grew to contain the lists of thousands of people classified by the kind of work that they did. And these were meant to be removed from libraries. They're actually, Wolfgang Herrmann's blacklists were the basis of the book burnings that took place throughout Germany in 1933, where rioting students would actually take books on this blacklist, pull them out of shelves, pull them out of stores, and burn them in massive pyres. So this blacklist shaped, in many ways, the Nazi censorship campaign, especially as it affected books. So one of the things that we can look at is we can just see, how much of an impact did this have on public discourse in Nazi Germany, and we can compare different parts of the list. We can compare, writers who Wolfgang Herrmann classified as writers about politics, or people who are writing about literature, people who are writing about history, and just as another sort of control group, I just include a list of Nazis. So you can see that folks who were associated with the Nazi Party are peaking very, very, very sharply in Nazi Germany, but folks who are on Herrmann's blacklists are not. Right? They are globally declining. And one of the things that's very striking, though, is that there is a marked difference between the various groups. So, for instance, if you're writing about philosophy and religion, and you're on Wolfgang Herrmann's blacklist, your frequency of mention is going to decline on the average, would have declined by about a factor of 4 in Nazi Germany under the Nazi regime. If you write about history, if you're a historian who's on Wolfgang Herrmann's blacklist, your frequency of mention would also decline, but only by about 9%. So the ability, the effectiveness of the blacklist as a tool for censorship and suppression of information seems to have been more efficacious for folks who are writing about philosophy and religion and topics of that type than folks who are historians. Again, I mean, this is just a first pass. But it is, I think, both interesting and also important to be able to quantify these sorts of effects. One of the things that you can actually do with this, because this effect is actually so strong, is you can actually automate the detection of who it was that the Nazis were censoring. So for instance, here's Henri Matisse, and I'm just using this as an example to show how our method works. right? You can look at how frequently was he mentioned before some target period of interest, in this case, the Nazi regime, how frequently was he mentioned after the target period of interest, and you can use a very, very moronic model, which is just assume that somehow his frequency of mention during the Nazi period, barring any outside influence, should have just been the weighted average of the two. And then you can compare his actual frequency of mention to that weighted average. And if the actual frequency of mention is much lower than the weighted average, he's suggests that maybe he's being suppressed. If it's much higher than the weighted average, maybe he's benefiting from propaganda. Now you can make a plot of what these values look like, and this is a plot of famous people created for the English language from the period from 1933 to 1945. And that value in the middle actually shouldn't say 0, it should say 1. So it's no effect, right, if you're at the middle. So what this is actually showing you is that this notion of just taking the weighted average to guess how frequently someone should be mentioned actually works really, really well. There is less than 1% of the names on our list that are more than 5-fold away from what that weighted average would suggest. Now, when I show you English, I'm actually not just showing you English. In some sense, basically every language in every time and place where things are at all vaguely normal typically looks like this. What you see for Germany from 1933 to 1945 is a massive outlier. First, the entire distribution is shifted to the left. The typical person is being suppressed on some level. The people that you would have expected based on their frequency of mention up to 1933 to be mentioned, from 33 to 45 are typically mentioned a lot less often than you expect. The distribution is also much wider. So you see folks at the right extreme who seem to be benefiting from some sort of government propaganda. And then you see a huge portion of this distribution at the left extreme. In fact, about more than 10% of the names on this list are more than 5-fold suppressed. Right? They're doing far worse than one would expect. Right? This is just vastly more than you see in the English distribution. And if you just look at some of the names that are appearing at the extremes, it's folks like Pablo Picasso, again, a modern artist who was was very much on the outs with the way that the Nazis thought about art. Or one of the most extreme names, one of the most extreme outliers is a man named Hermann Maas. He was a Protestant minister who was protesting what the Nazis were doing, and he became actually the target of a personal campaign against Hermann Maas by the Ministry of Culture, by the Nazi Ministry of Culture. And you can see is an extreme outlier. His frequency of mention craters during the Nazi regime. Now, I've been giving you this historical example of Nazi suppression, but one of the things that's very striking is that this is actually happening today. In many places, one place that is certainly suppressing information is the Chinese government. You can see here just mention of Tiananmen Square. There are two events, two major events that people discuss typically in the West that occurred in Tiananmen Square. There's one in 1976, a protest in 1976, and then the protest in 1989, or the Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, in the West, in English books, we typically talk much, much more about the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. You can see in Chinese books, folks, talked for quite a while about what happened in 1976. But for the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, there's only a tiny blip that disappears very rapidly. And what you're seeing is clearly the effects of broad censorship of information about Tiananmen Square in China. Now, there's been many news, it's not news in some sense, right? There's been many news articles that have reported the fact that the Chinese are censoring such and such novel about Tiananmen Square, such and such piece of information about Tiananmen Square. What you're seeing here is not a particular publication being censored, but just the broad effect of censorship over the entire canon of Chinese literature, the entire written output of Chinese civilization. And it's a very, very striking plot. This plot is apparently so striking, actually, that when our book went up for auction in China, we got a number of publishers who looked at the book, read the whole book, and I guess found most of the book unobjectionable. But there were a page and a half, and they sent us an email. They said, oh, yeah, you know, book looks great, but there's this page and a half, and we think it's not really suitable for China, and we will only bid on your book if you get rid of it, which includes this plot. So, I mean, I guess, you know, it's, I guess the impact of an engram is in some sense bigger than we expected. There are, you know, and I've been pretty widely assured that there is essentially no way that we will actually get this engram printed in China, though we've been trying. 1 billion people cannot see this plot. You know, this is, you know, it's not just that one cannot write about Tiananmen Square. One cannot plot, you know, make plots about writing about Tiananmen Square. Now, the use of automated censorship detection, for instance, in online settings is, I think, actually potentially something that could be quite important for freedom of information in the future. The Chinese government certainly suppresses information online. If there was some way to detect that in real time, and I think techniques like this will enable that, it might be possible to work around that censorship process. One of the nice things about the Ngram data is, I mean, you can read about it, and you know, we wrote this book about our adventures exploring the Ngram data, but you can also just play with it yourself. It's surprisingly addictive. It has been described as the greatest time waster in the history of the internet. I want people to bear in mind that this was said after the release of Angry Birds. So this is a pretty impressive accolade. Lots of people do this. It's been used zillions of times. In fact, it's now part of Google's dictionary. If you just click define banana or whatever you will in Google and press the little arrow, it actually shows you data from this. So in some sense, we did end up getting our lexiscope. You know, lots of people do this all day long. This is an example, actually, that we open up the book with, where we look at when did people start using the United States in the singular. And the other nice thing about this is you can use this as a new way to explore books, right? If you see an effect at a particular period of time, you can just sort of click at an appropriate point, and it will say, oh, here are, you know, some of the books that are actually contributing to this signal. So I know many historians actually who use this as a way to find primary sources that they should explore. Lots of people have run queries. I mean, I think, I don't know, like 50 million or 100 million, some gazillion million queries have now been run on the Ngram Viewer. And, you know, I mean, in some sense, all of the queries, you know, we're very proud of them. They're all like your children. I mean, not really like your children, but, you know, like data sets that you feel very proud of. You know, and so you don't really want to judge. But to some extent, I think it is sometimes helpful to, you know, to tell people which ones are the most interesting. And I think of all the many gazillions of queries that have been run, this one is certainly the best. So somebody noticed something interesting on the internet, imagine that. They said, look, you know, strange thing. You know, these days, most people, they want to put their best foot forward. They want to make the best impression. They want to do their best. But somehow, before 1800, people didn't seem interested in that, right? They didn't want to put their best foot forward. They wanted to put their best foot forward. They wanted to do their best and be the best they could be. What's the story with that? Or were they just striving for mediocrity? Actually, there is an interesting story with that, which is that the letter S used to be written differently. When it appeared at the beginning or middle of words, it appeared in this form called the medial S, which looks much, much longer, which optical character recognition tended at that point to call an F. This is actually where the integral sign comes from in calculus. It's just the letter S. Other things you can look at, this I mean, this is a study in frustration. Some things are more frustrating than others. You know, like if you stub your toe, I would say that that's a 1A arg. If your planet is annihilated by the Vogons to make room for an interstellar bypass, that would be an 8A arg. You can study anything from a 1 to an 8A arg with the Ngram Viewer, and you will still actually get a reasonable amount of data. You will get a chart. This particular person only did up to 4 and then got exhausted. What's interesting, and I guess this is good news, increasingly frustrating things appear to be increasingly rare in the world. I think that's good news for all of us, except in the early 80s, where the 2A arg briefly became more frequent than the 1A arg, and I am at a loss to explain this. Now, the following is a web comic called XKCD. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but XKCD was actually an inspiration to us. I think you can see that the style of the graphs that I showed you and the graphs in the books were really inspired by the XKCD comic. And I was very gratified. You know, everyone has like their major goals in life, and for me, one of them was to have, you know, and for JB as well, one of them was to have our work lampooned by XKCD. And this is actually a you know, chart that the Randall Munroe at XKCD made. This is real data he's showing. On real axis, this is the real deal. This is the trajectory for the word sustainable. And I apologize for those of you in the back. You might not be able to see this quite as well, but you can see the line is going up. That dot, that's the present day, when the frequency of sustainable is about 1 in 100,000. That is the frequency of the word. But the frequency of sustainable is increasing very, very rapidly, and he projects the trend into the future. For instance, by 2036, he projects that the word sustainable will occur once on the average on every page of English text. But of course, at current rates, it does not stop there. By the year 2061, the word sustainable is going to occur on the average of once in every sentence in the English language, as it did in this one. Now, by the year 2109, Randall Munroe projects all sentences are going to be composed entirely of the word sustainable, sustainable, sustainable. And after that, it's just anyone's guess what's going to happen to the English language. His startling conclusion is that the word sustainable is unsustainable. Now, there are many great ideas in this chart. One of them is, wouldn't it be great if we could draw these line graphs in cartoony, hand-drawn looking ways? And so we played around a lot with that and did it in the book, and I think they look nicer, a little bit more appealing. But the other is, you know, this is a pretty reasonable question. Can we actually predict the future using Engrams? So here's something. This is the last analysis I guess I'll show you, probably the last analysis I'll show you. So I said, can we predict the future? We're going to do the dumbest thing in the world, right? We're going to pretend we're very, 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 very bad day traders, right? All we do is, like, we look, right? And if the stock has been going up for the last few days, or in this case, the last 10 years, we sort of guess it's going to keep going up. And if it's been going down for the last 10 years, we just sort of guess it's going to keep going down. Now, that works very, very badly for the stock market, as Eugene Fama discovered, and that was a good discovery for him. He won the Nobel Prize this year. Congratulations, Professor Fama. Anyway, so he did the same thing with Engrams that Eugene Fama had done with the stock market. So in gray, you're seeing a bunch of Engrams that do badly for 20 years. They're going down for 20 years. And we just pick them at random, right? Everything that does badly for 20 years, we put it in that bin. And then in black, you're seeing a whole bunch of Engrams that all did well. They did very well for 20 years in a row, right? So we're going to, see if they continue to do well. And lo and behold, if you trace out how they do subsequently, there does seem to be some sort of cultural inertia. That is strange as all heck. I think that the words I choose in this sentence are somehow up to me. And I think that in some sense, because we all have free will, we are, free to choose the future of our language and our culture and this and that and the other. But the weird thing is that there do seem to be these trends where I could make money. I mean, if there was a market for this, if someone in this audience would like to make a market for this, please let me know. There's a market for this. I could make money. I could say, look, here are some things, and I don't know who's going to say them. I don't know why they're going to say them, but I can pretty much make a really good bet that 30 years from now, people are going to be saying more of this than they're saying now, right? The notion that we can do, that there is some sort of cultural determinism on large scales is utterly baffling. But I think in many ways this summarizes a lot of what's exciting about Engrams, right? It's a first look. It can be interesting, it can be surprising, it can give us great insight, and it can also simply perplex us. But it is a first look at our history in a very new way. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. That's what the book is about. So I think the first question is, was the Thrive versus Throve plot based on the 5 million books, those being only 4% of all books published? And the answer is yes. So yeah, the Thrive versus Throve plot, as well as all the other plots that I showed you in this data, was based on 4% of all books ever published in the English language, except actually I cheated. Some of our more recent stuff is based on 6% of all books ever published in the English language we powered up. Has the book project helped you in better understanding or analyzing genetic data? Well, so that's a very interesting question. There's one very specific idea that I think emerged from the book project that I think was extremely useful in thinking about genetic data. But the truth of the matter is that I think more broadly what is useful is the paradigms that are involved in the analysis of data in the sciences broadly, I think are changing. I think they are shifting much, much more towards visualization, interactive visualization of data as a method for discovery of new effects. And I think broadly speaking, it's just good to practice doing that, and it hardly matters what you practice on. So if you have a fascinating data set that comes from books, you can get pretty good at doing that, and that practice will help you when you go back to study genetic data. So for instance, my group does most of what we do these days is actually in the genetics domain, but we emphasize visualization very, very, very strongly at a very, very early stage in our projects, and it's certainly the case that my experience with the Engram data was one of the big influencers for doing that. I would love to mash up Engram data with data from my company. Is there an API? There is an API. There's actually stuff that's in some sense better than an API, but what there is actually that's even better than that is we released all of the data. You can just download all of the Engrams data for free under a very, very permissive license. So you can just take the data and do what you want with it, and it's all yours. So we do have some APIs. You can talk to me, I guess, after about some APIs that my group has available, but you can just take the data. Can you recommend career paths for college students interested in this topic? Let's see. So I guess there's things to do in college and there's things to do after college. So I guess I'll tell you both sorts of things. I mean, I think the things to do in college is it's probably good to take, computer science courses. I think those are very useful. I think in general, courses in, mathematics and data visualization, computer science very broadly are extremely useful. Designing your own websites, getting really good at MySQL and Solr and databases and all that sort of thing. It's very, very useful. But I think the most useful thing is, and this is a really important thing actually, is that big data is very, very democratic. There's a lot of data out there that no one's ever looked at that you can get by just poking around the internet, getting good at scraping websites. You can do that. You probably don't need a course to do that. You just need to develop computational chops and then do it. So what you should do is find some large data set, collect it, and then do something fascinating with it, create an amazing visualization with it, and share it with the world. And I think the next 20 projects like this that are massively successful, I would guess that 5 of them are going to be done by teenagers who just hack up something interesting, and it resonates with the world. There's a lot of stuff like that. There was somebody in my group who actually did something that was pretty neat that I think resonated with a lot of people. He used Engrams data. I mean, in this particular case, it was Engrams data, where he pointed it at all these historical TV shows and used it to identify anachronisms. And it turns out he's like vastly better than like any linguist on earth at identifying all these subtle anachronisms in shows like Mad Men and Boardwalk Empire, et cetera, et cetera. That was really neat. And so I think he created a blog about that, and every week people sort of tune in to see all the things that their favorite shows have done wrong. What do you hope to achieve at the end of your research? Well, I mean, I think in some sense research is like, one has a research portfolio. I think I have a bunch of different goals for my research. There's one central goal is simply to do interesting things that lead to people thinking about problems in a new way. And thinking about questions in their own life, questions that they've encountered in the past or in a new way, and to think about new questions that they wouldn't have expected to think about. And then obviously, I think people who are doing science should be striving to make contributions that improve the state of the world. I don't know. I think Engrams improve the state of the world in some sense, not the same sense that a vaccine for smallpox would. If there was an axis for improve the state of the world, I don't know that we would be off the charts on that axis. But you got to do different things. If you have a fun opportunity, an interesting opportunity, I think it's reasonable to take it.
Erez?
Yes.
I just want to give people a chance in the audience if they
Sure.
want to ask a question in person. Is there anybody we have a microphone? Right here. And by the way, before I give this microphone, I just want to remind everybody, he will sign autographs of his book, which is for sale over here right afterwards. So make sure you do that. Sure.
What would be applications of this method in shorter time frame, real-time situations, politics or stock market or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of approach is, I think one of the things that, for instance, Nate Silver's work, highlighted is the incredible value of relatively straightforward, and I don't think Nate Silver would disagree that his approaches were in some sense relatively straightforward. Engrams is relatively straightforward, but relatively straightforward thinking about data and the power of that to give you insights into social trends more generally. I think Nate Silver obviously has probably permanently changed the dialogue around electoral punditry, around trying to figure out where are people at about particular issues by simply showing that the data is actually pretty decisive, and you don't have to guess at these things the way that in the past we would have guessed about Thrive and Throve. You can just measure them. So I think that that's absolutely something that applies broadly in the political realm. I think it applies pretty broadly in the economic realm. I think it's very often the case that one can go ahead and use data, for instance, from Twitter to tell you, is the following movie likely to do extremely well? Well, you can do a pretty good job quantifying buzz around a movie. There's a lot of goods for which their value is to some extent intertwined with the buzz around them, so going on a vacation to a particular destination, things like that, where, one can use online content to get a sense of how much interest is there in something, and therefore how valuable is that thing. So I think there's a lot of broad utility in the notion of quantifying social trends, and then of course quantifying trends in data more generally. That's had a huge impact. Anyone who's used, for instance, the Faircast website has benefited from the work that Faircast puts into predicting based on huge amounts of data, is this airplane ticket likely to get more expensive or less expensive? Those sorts of predictions where you companies are constantly trying to predict stuff about you, but with the aid of websites like Faircast, you can make predictions about companies and take advantage of them. So I think there's a broad array of applications.
Can you hear me? Yeah, in the beginning, you sort of said something about how the data is sort of dumb and humans are using it and so on. I was just curious if there was any reference to or response to this concept of the singularity, where artificial intelligence reaches the point where it's equal to human intelligence, and then beyond that, we don't know where it's going to go because it no longer needs humans.
I mean, I think one thing that we can see in our data is, based on our data, it does seem like technological advances are accelerating. I mean, I think my guess is the pundits, probably got to that one first. But it's interesting to be able to measure that. I mean, as far as getting to the question of being able to read texts effectively and the artificial intelligence that's required there, I mean, I think you're kind of right that on some level what you need is, I don't know, singularity grade AI, right? I mean, the problem of reading and comprehending texts very effectively, I mean, and I don't mean in, even the achievements of Watson, for instance, in Jeopardy were very, 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 very impressive, but that's a very stylized piece of text. The full complexity of human language is really, 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 really hard to understand. Basically, the ways in which people tend to make any progress on this with computers doesn't really involve the computers seeming to quite understand the text. So for instance, Google's huge advances in machine translation ultimately boil down to throwing vast amount of data at the problem and just noticing that this 4 words and that 4 words tend to be associated with one another. That works incredibly well for translation, but it doesn't seem to get us any closer to the heart of the strong AI problem. In general, I think academics fairly broadly are pessimistic about strong AI because, for decades people said strong AI is around the corner, beware of the Terminator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that strong AI, in terms of the ability to comprehend complex, human communication behavior, has been a really, really, really hard problem. With that said, look, I mean, AI does keep achieving things, and of course, every time a computer achieves something, we just say, oh, you don't have to be smart to do that. You don't have to be smart to play chess or win Jeopardy or, I guess Wheel of Fortune. That's where, really, I don't know. But, so it's interesting to see that in some sense, I think we are struggling with what it is that human intelligence means. But I do think, and sometimes we do have to make retreats on that front, but I do think that it remains the case that when you start talking about understanding complex human communication as manifested, for instance, in a text, computers are just dreadful at it, and they haven't been making meaningful progress in, they haven't been making meaningful progress.
Time for one more question right over here.
Given what you've said, what do you think about the movement of some companies to begin using big data and computers to assess candidates in their hiring process?
That is, that has obvious advantages and obvious massive pitfalls and concerns, right? I mean, I think, that's just a great example of something that, has, it's, has a bright side and has a dark side. I think it's very, very concerning, certainly, to hand over the reins to computers in general. But with that said, practically speaking, my impression is that people have been handing things over to algorithms in some sense for a long time, right? Every time you hear about the following medical school has the following MCAT cutoff, I mean, what is that, right? That is more or less a computer algorithm that is so simple, look if the MCAT score is higher than such and such, that a human can do it. People have been doing that for a long time. It seems that it is practically necessary when filtering a large number of candidates to do something like that. And I guess computers would probably, do a better job than your MCAT score must be bigger, higher than, I don't know, 26. No matter what you have done in your life, if your MCAT score is not higher than 26, there's nothing that could compensate for it, right? Clearly, computer could do something more nuanced there. But I think it has, I mean, I guess what I would say there is, in some sense, society has struggled with a parallel set of problems whenever we just try to quantify people, whenever we try to say, you know, cutoffs, whenever we try to give people a quantitative test and say, okay, you did well on your SAT or your GRE or your LSAT or whatever it is, therefore you must be clever, therefore we should admit you. You know, it's a hard thing. I don't know. There's 7 billion people on a planet, and it's hard to look at each other fully as individuals. And I think that is a great struggle.
Thank you so much. And again, the book is for sale over here, and he will sign autographs right over here.
Thank you so much. I'll take this from you.